Welcome to the C Word, the Conservators podcast. Today we're talking about working with front of house. I'm Jenny Mathiasson, an Objects Conservator based in Carmarthenshire.
And I'm Kloe Rumsey, an Objects Conservator based in Greater Manchester.
Oh my god, welcome back to the show, everyone.
Welcome to season 9.
I know, right? That's a strange feeling. I hope everyone's been all right as we all can be. We're still here. Hi.
Hi.
Today we're basically having another installment of our Working With kind of series that we've started.
Let's call it a series. Sounds good.
Yeah. Let's call it a series. It is, because there's now more than one installment, which is important. Today we're going to talk about working with front of house, which I think is really exciting. And to help us explore this topic, we've got a couple of awesome guest hosts with us today. Would you guys like to introduce yourselves?
Sure. Hi, I'm Abby. I'm a duty manager at the Holborn Museum in Bath, and I'm also co-founder of Front of House Museums Network.
Hello, my name is Will Tregaskes. I'm museum manager at the Cannon Valley Museum in Abigail in South Wales, and I'm also a co-founder of Front of House and Museums.
Yay! Welcome, guys!
Yay! Brilliant! Hello!
So excited to have you here. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, long-time listener, first-time caller.
Loving it. So you guys founded this network. Do you want to tell us a bit more about the network?
We founded it in summer of 2017. Seems like ages ago now. It's not that long ago, really. And we were working together, and we got chatting. We're both sort of coming out of studying and wanting to make an impact. We're both of us working front of house. Both of us with looking for careers in museums, and we were like, not as many people talking about front of house in the sector as you see elsewhere. And there's no large public image of front of house, and where are the voices for front of house? And we really wanted to not be the voices, but be part of the conversation.
Yeah.
And we also sort of noticed that, because we were working in a large team at the time, and Will and I were both quite career-focused young professionals, and we sort of noticed that not everyone had the same access to information on training and things. We just took a particular interest in that. So in its very baby days, we just kind of started it as an information sharing network for front of house staff. And then we put it on Twitter, and it just got this big kind of national, lots of people joining in the conversation sort of thing. And the rest is kind of history, really.
I mean, I have to say that I think of the network as kind of a force of nature at this point, right? It's been really good at, you know, kind of raising issues and campaigning for, all sorts of things, like just feeling more valued at work. There was that survey about how, front of house members are often feeling really undervalued at work and stuff like that. And the fact that you guys are kind of, being people who can kind of raise those sorts of issues and talk about them and really highlight them and join in conversations has been really fantastic to see, and hugely important, I would say. So it's super cool to have you here, guys.
Thank you. We're excited to be here.
Yeah.
What is front of house? Because I just want to say that as a huge museum nerd, right? But as a baby museum nerd, I didn't know what front of house was. It was this label that was used in museums, and I didn't really understand it as an outsider. And then whenever I talk to my parents or other people who aren't in the business, then I usually go, the people who are the face of the museum, the people who greet you, the people who you interact with, basically, the people you think of as the museum workers, they are the people. That's this group. I have to explain it, because front of house is such a kind of internal use kind of label, or at least that's how I felt, or people don't necessarily know what it means automatically. I guess I've slightly answered the question now by who these people are, but it's broader than that. It's so many different kinds of tasks that front of house does, and I thought we could maybe unpick that a little bit, just in case there's anyone listening who's like, actually, I could do with a definition.
It depends on the institution as well, doesn't it? Because I imagine you've both worked in a number of different roles, and had colleagues and friends who have worked in a number of different roles as well, and had different responsibilities within those.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've worked in as a volunteer and as a paid member of staff in big, huge organisations with very clearly defined roles, and then sort of smaller, more independent museums where you get kind of a bit more of everything, and you're sort of dipping into other departments. So yeah, it's quite fluid and loose, really.
Definitely. I've had the same experience going from a site with over 1 million visitors a year to a site with 20 to 30,000 visitors a year. There's a huge variety of front of house experiences. And I think our network, we try and represent all the different voices, but also the breadth. I think we often see front of house not as like a box ticking exercise, but more of a spectrum of front of house roles. So some roles are more public facing, some are less, but ultimately museums are there for the public, really. One of our early sayings was museums are just self-storage units for someone else's collection without front of house.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, without that kind of enabling, what are you even looking at, you know? What you're talking about with the kind of the spectrum of a job role, I think that's a really important thing. And it's something that I mean, definitely applies to conservators as well. We have a huge range of things, but I think it's easy to think that, you know, a job role is one thing, and that's never true of any institution or any person. It's always gonna be varied, isn't it?
Well, conservators have a very definite sort of, you go to university to do conservation, and although we're trying not to do that now. Yeah, but let's face it, we're not there yet, are we?
No.
And that will change in time, I imagine. But at the moment, if you've got anything remotely associated with conservation in your job title, you will probably have been selected for your job because you have, you know, skills as well as degree in conservation. I would like to say, or associated experience, but I don't really feel like that's really realistic at the moment. But if front of house has many more different routes into it, then that's the part of the route of the variation, do you think?
Definitely. Our research showed in 2019 that increasingly, as you go down the career ladder, so looking at early museum professionals and like people at the mid-career, it was increasingly evident that more people are starting in front of house than in the past.
So we mentioned a bit about how front of house can be paid or voluntary, for example. What are your feelings on that? Because I know how we in conservation might feel about things that are not paid.
Mm-hmm. It's complicated, isn't it? Because I think we as a sector really do rely on volunteers. And also, I work quite closely with volunteers in my role, and you can see lots of people joining volunteering for different reasons. And predominantly, it's to kind of give back to the community. And so, like, the motivations are not necessarily career focused, but there is certainly a cohort of that I work with as well. So what we try to do as much as we can is sort of provide good and useful working experience. I mean, this is just a massive topic, isn't it?
It is. It's huge. And it's, you know, definitely one that deserves its own episode for sure.
For my part, I've certainly had really positive volunteer experiences, but I would also say that I have had other volunteer. I mean, I think I volunteered maybe 3 or 4 times in my career, and it's just for purely trying to get that experience, right? Yeah. And I have definitely woken up on my days off just extremely resenting the fact that I've got to catch a bus and a train to get to some museum to get to touch an object, where I have had full-time employment in a museum full of objects and, you know, no way of kind of breaking out of my role to get near them in my own paid professional work. That's certainly something Will and I have kind of talked about as a network as well, is just like how difficult it can be to get those experiences. But equally, I mean, I've also had really lovely, positive, and wouldn't change them at all volunteer experiences also.
It's a really complex environment to be in. And like I'm additionally a steering group member for the Heritage Volunteering Group, and working with them, we've seen such a variety of reasons why people volunteer, and the work in that side, rather than there's a lot of problematic issues around people having to volunteer to get jobs and stuff. But I think that's one segment, and there are many other reasons why people volunteer in museums, and I think it's inherently part of the nature of museums being at that interface with the public. And as we're becoming more community driven, more democratic, that boundary can only blur, in my view, because of our conscious decision to try and make museums more relevant to communities. You're going to get people wanting to contribute more. Look at small museums across the country. They're going to be some of the most embedded museums in the country, in those local communities. having a much more intrinsic relationship with groups of people. You've got the trustees who will be more hands-on. You've got volunteers who simply, without them, you wouldn't be able to get the museum open to the public because the funding isn't there. And in many ways, those volunteers can retrospectively ensure staff are able to focus on securing future funding and developing the organisation rather than because they have the support of the community behind them.
Yeah, that is the interesting thing about the difference between the front of house and the collections back of house side of things, isn't it? That though it might be there might be more, I'm trying to think of how to phrase this, because if a lot of what we're saying is that if front of house can act as a bridge towards getting careers in collections work, it seems that there is more sort of museum willingness to spend money on, in the cases where they can spend money, to spend money on front of house. But in some cases also, that, as we've seen recently, that front of house is the first to go, and that job is often either outsourced or it's 0 hour or whatever, that it's kind of the most vital in a way of getting the public in, but also the least valued.
Yeah, there's so many challenges at the moment, and I think of any roles in the museum sector, the ones which are perhaps most tied to the economic success of an organisation is going to be front of house, retail, shop, any admission charging one. Those roles expand with the season, contracted season. You don't tend to see that happening back of house as much, and that's part of the whole tourism leisure industry, isn't it? It's just a symptom of the wider norms. It's also, I would say, where you're more likely to see 0 hour contracts, short-term casual contracts as well.
Yeah, for sure. And it is one of those, precarious things where volunteering is a good thing, and it's wonderful when people can volunteer. Obviously, that's grand, but there's such a danger, when the budget purse shrinks significantly, that people go, yeah, but other people work with just volunteers, so we don't need to pay people, and that's not okay. It's these are your staff members. Treat them right, Jesus.
Definitely.
How did you guys get started in front of house? How did this start?
So mine started, I was finishing uni and I sent out my CV to loads of places looking for a summer.
What did you study?
Archaeology.
Oh, same.
I was studying archaeology.
High five.
And I was looking for work and to try and fund a master's. And I put out within a radius of where I lived. And I got my first job working in front of house. I then was doing that on a flexible contract while studying. And then I briefly tried to work as an archaeologist, realised that my knees couldn't take it. and I think at the same time I was realising I actually really like working with people. And even I did care of collections studying right in that year. I was interested in that intangible relationship with the public and sort of exploring conservation of the intangible. So it really fitted well with front of house and how the public engage with collections and that side. So I began to realise that my love of museums is not to do with the collection itself, it's to do with the people who engage with the collections.
That is lovely.
Yeah.
Yeah, for me, I graduated doing history and had no idea what to do with my life, and just kind of stumbled on a volunteering opportunity at the V&A. I was living in Bicester, just outside of Oxford, and I got a volunteering position at the Museum of Oxford, and then got one at the V&A. I worked in retail at the time, and then got my first paid position about 6 months later. And it's just great to talk to the public about anything that they find interesting in the museum. It's really hard to, I get such a great deal of job satisfaction out of those kind of small interactions, but frequent interactions on how someone's really enjoying a certain aspect of something, information sharing, watching children kind of point at something and say, oh, wow, that is so old. It's a gratifying space to be.
Yeah.
And yeah, just to, like Will say, it is quite an intangible thing. There's so much positive aspects of working in front of house that we also try to champion as a network as well.
Yeah.
I mean, there's certainly plenty to complain about, but that's the thing. I think so many people across the sector do agree, front of house is so valuable to the sector. customer service and interfacing with the public, it's such a skill. You have to be so resilient and patient and understanding and compassionate.
That's really badass. I like it.
Yeah, that's a really good way of looking at it as well. And I think I've worked in a number of different places. So from the SMG level large museums and smaller museum of kind of 30 members of staff, including front of house, who we'd in my current museum would call visitor services assistants, which I like because it's the way of describing their roles to the visitors as being visitor focused rather than by comparison to back of house, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
And there are so many different types of roles and types of ways of engaging with the public, and they are all specific skills. And the thing that, not to bang on too much about what I'm worried about or what to complain about in terms of the sort of transient nature, I suppose, in some ways of front of house positions, but if you don't have job security, you'll end up losing staff members who have become really, really good at talking to the audience that they have in their museum. Yeah. And that's one of the things that concerns me, that not only is it the really nitty gritty of I have learnt everything about everything in this gallery, it's also this is how to engage with the public that we have here. And this is the kind of things that they find most interesting. And this is the kind of things that they like to, learn about after this and everything like that. So I do feel like curatorial and like conservation, by losing members of staff that are used to being in that museum and with that collection, is a huge loss.
Oh, it definitely is. I remember somewhere I worked briefly, it was one of these things of, I feel like what you kind of overheard in the staff room was the kind of thing of, oh, we love our front of house team because they really know what they're doing. But there was this trend of moving from permanent contracts and kind of phasing people out as they retired, thus losing that enormous amount of knowledge and the connection that, these people had with the collection and they could then communicate to visitors. And replacing these sort of permanent contracts with more temporary ones. And there was a real sense of grumbling about how, and these young people coming in, they don't know anything about it. It's just a job to them. And it was just like, there's a lot of lack of job security there, though. And you wouldn't necessarily have that problem if you offered people a slightly better deal. It was just like, so you've recognized that you're losing something valuable and you're sad about that, but that didn't translate into how can we solve that. It was just, these young people coming in and taking these miserable jobs that we give them, and it was just like, oh, come on.
With their avocados and their work ethic.
Exactly. How dare they want to be paid, etc. I was just like, okay, that may be it was just such a disconnect, which was really funny to me in a kind of a, tragicomical, kind of a, isn't that funny? I'm also on a 0-hour contract, by the way. But yeah, there was this recognition that there is a fantastic amount of knowledge in front of house, and that it's all about that connection and the enthusiasm that they can then transmit to people visiting the galleries, for example, and that was being lost, and the recognition that was a sad thing. Again, we're talking about the kind of interface here between visitor and collection.
Exactly. I think that perfectly sums it up, doesn't it? Is to a public, in many respects, is the person they envision when they think about a museum, because that's the person they've talked to.
Yeah.
And me and Abby often say when people are talking about this topic around how you treat and value your staff, is if your public values you've prescribed on a published document, you've gone to conferences on it, if it's not seen in your front of house team, the values your organisation have don't exist to the view of the public in the galleries.
Yeah. I remember this being a thing that in another place I used to work, that we, through Force of Nature, head of visitor services, front of house was included in a lot more of the kind of boring meetings, but the meetings they should really be at, if you see what I mean, where it's people making decisions about what the collection looks like and what we're going to show next and that sort of thing. And it's like, yeah, but you want to have someone at the table who can, tell you something about the people who are coming in or the people who aren't coming in, or
had just the same experience.
Yeah. And so it was such a good step to just include those voices at the table, but it, I feel like it took some real wrangling to get to that point, which I thought was so curious. Isn't that a given? There should be a place for front of house at the table. That's so odd.
That's so funny. That's our key complaint that we so for our last survey that we did in 2019, we had an additional comment section, and I'd say that's about easily 1/3 of all of the negative feelings that people have working in front of house, was the fact that they weren't allowed a seat at the table, even for things that directly affected them.
Yeah.
You know, the amount of times I've been managing a queue or something like that, and sort of head management have been in front of me discussing how best to rearrange the queue without asking me.
I'm right here.
Nice. Nice.
Or sort of better signage so that people can find the toilets, you know, or find a certain gallery. They'll have that discussion right in front of you, and it will be anyone from like the marketing department to curatorial, but the people who directly interface with people not being able to find the toilets or not being able to find a gallery or not looking at a certain label, they could tell you in 2 minutes what the problem is.
Well, exactly. And I mean, I think it's like at some point there was a conversation in one of these like kind of office scenarios where it's like, oh, well, whoever's in, these guys will probably know. And there was a discussion about, well, what are our most popular objects on display? And it's like, why would we know that? We sit up here. We don't see that. Ask the people who would know. But yeah, there was this strange assumption that because with the collections people, we would know that bit about the collection. And it's like, well, no. I mean, what the collections officer can tell you is how many people email about that object. They can't tell you how many people stop and go, oh my God, it's a polar bear. You know, it's just...
I often ask front of house whether they've spotted any problems in the galleries, because they're the ones that are walking around them.
Well, yeah.
And I can zoom through the galleries on a weekly check and look at everything, but I won't necessarily be able to spot whether something has shifted in a case or whether, you know.
Well, yeah, exactly, right?
There's any particular change or problem.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that brings us quite neatly to like how we as conservators work with front of house and like what our experiences are of that. So, Kloe, that's a really great example of that sort of thing. Like, the knowledge of front of house is what nourishes me when I work in a museum setting.
Yeah,
because there's nothing like having someone, you know, come and check something with you and just be like, look, I've seen this insect. And I'm not really sure what it is. I thought you could come and have a look. And I'll be like, oh, I'm there. That worries me immensely. And if I'm lucky, it's just, oh, look, we have more ladybirds. That's fine. And if I'm unlucky, it's like, oh, that's a carpet beetle. That should not be there.
Or this has shifted. Or I saw somebody, a lot of times, I mean, this sounds alarming, but we've got quite a lot. My museum has a fair number of open display textiles. And a number of times someone will come into the studio and say, I've just seen this. I asked them to stop, but I wondered if you wanted to have a look and just double check that nothing untoward has happened. And that's fantastic because they are the, eyes and ears. And usually it helps them for me to be able to point out and say, well, this is what to look out for if you see anything that this has happened to. But this is one of my kind of really sort of favorite topics about working with different colleagues, because I've worked in, as I said before, the big London groups where you've got multiple different facets of a front of house team. Like in the Science Museum group, you've got explainers, visitor services, and then estates. And then in my current role, all of those jobs are one group of people who are probably about 5 people. That sort of changes the role so completely. So I'd be interested to hear, as well as talk about our own experiences of working with different front of house teams, but also what it's like being those different teams and working in different groups and getting new jobs in that sort of environment. So what are your favourite roles then that you take on as front of house? Do you work in, or have you worked in very specific roles, or do you prefer working in the sort of all things kind of roles?
Oh yeah, like is it better to have a really broad one or better? Do you like it better? Nothing's objectively better.
For me, front of house can give you an incredible insight into the reality of museums. You see the daily operation of the museum. You see why it's there, why it exists, I think. And but also equally, if you choose to work in a small museum at the start of your career or early on in your career, you can really see every single element of a museum. So I've been at Canberra Museum for 3 years. If my role was in a large organization, I don't know. I think my front of house element would be much smaller, but because there's only equivalent to 3 full-time staff, we do see the public on a lot. We engage with them. We are the first point of contact. But also I do a lot of the other elements which we would consider front of house, so like operations, room bookings, events, marketing, all those things which are about engaging with public. We do all of them because we are a small organization, and that's what we do. My earlier career would have been in that more public-facing role, that engagement solely, split along. So you've got operations on one side, which is focusing on the infrastructure and security of the site. And then you've got the front of house of visitor services team focusing on the engagement with the public. And it's not a clean-cut line. Like operations and security are going to be good at talking to the public as well, because they engage, particularly like security, they have to be a welcoming but also forceful presence depending on the situation. So that's an incredible skill set in itself at a major attraction, to both be constantly ensuring visitor safety but also not intimidating and making it a welcoming experience, because often they have to have the same level of information about the museum at the entrance as a person on the front entrance.
Do you want to talk about your experiences, Abby?
Yeah.
Sure. Okay, so full disclosure, I actually have 2 jobs at the moment. So my full-time position is as duty manager at the Holborn, and I have a casual contract with the Roman Baths as a visitor experience host.
Oh, host, I like it.
Yeah, they changed the title from visitor services assistant to visitor experience host, because, that's the kind of direction our service is taking. So, it's quite interesting.
Yeah.
I do the kind of different operation sides of things at the Holborn. So it can be a variety of everything, from someone getting trapped in a lift, hopefully not too often, to, something happening outside in the gardens, opening and closing the building, or, the kind of events back when we could have events, and interacting with the volunteers and making sure they're all supported in the day. But it's also quite nice to kind of take a little step back from the level of responsibility when I do go to the baths to kind of, pre the COVID times when we could deliver tours and have chats and do all the fun elements of visitor engagement.
Yeah. I thought it was really interesting, kind of just very quickly talking about the different things to be called front of house and like what the job roles can be called, because that is something that varies wildly, which might be another reason why people might not be familiar with the term front of house sometimes, because it's just, it's the visitor facing job role, but it's called a million different things. And I know that it changed several times just at the last museum I worked at. It was all sorts of things from visitor services assistant to heritage and retail assistant, and like all sorts of things, just to kind of
gallery assistant I've had before. Gallery attendant.
Yeah, there's so many, and it's almost, I would say, it's one of the indicators of what that organization's like. Their vision for what front of house does often is hinted in the name of their staff or how the staff are divided. It's an interesting clue.
Right, so we've kind of mentioned that sometimes front of house helps us in obviously our jobs as conservators, particularly with things like spotting potential damage or things that have shifted in the galleries or alerting us to insects. Super great to have that relationship, but it's quite a passive relationship, and it's one of my great regrets that I haven't had a more active relationship with front of house and the organizations I've been in. And that makes me kind of question, like, I wonder what that relationship would have looked like if I could have put more time into it or more effort into it. And I would be super curious to hear from, for example, listeners who've had a more active relationship with their front of house team, how you've engaged and collaborated, because I would love to hear about it.
I've had loads of experiences actually working with front of house.
Excellent.
In my current museum, I think my current job is, I feel like, a really nice sort of level of working with front of house, because they have such varied roles that they are sort of they can basically help with anything, is my attitude to front of house.
Versatile co-workers.
Versatile, yeah, exactly. Well, I think there's different people in the team, and some of them are, they've worked in as front of house for 10 years. They sort of, the thing that they enjoy is the estate side of things. They manage the building. They make sure everything is clean and tidy. They know the stuff about the collection that they need to, but their main interest is being the host, essentially. And there are other members of the team who are interested in the work because of the collection, and they're interested in the curatorial side of things and the object side of things. I think the first thing myself and my colleague wanted to do was, when we wanted to have a better working relationship with front of house, was to learn who was interested in what and who had a particular aptitude for what, and also particularly, I don't want to sound like it sounds sexist, but sometimes I'm just not tall enough and I'm just not strong enough to do a thing. And we've got really big, heavy objects sometimes in the collection, like 4 meter long giant cardboard tubes with textiles around them. You can't lift that on your own. Sometimes your colleague isn't there, and sometimes there's a desk way above head height that you need somebody to lift down from a shelf for you. So getting to know also the member of front of house who climbs in his spare time and is mega strong. And we actually have worked with a particular team in the past couple of years, and people are always willing and happy and able to learn everything. So I did object handling training with them. Obviously we work with conservation because that's sort of the the rules. Then it's our conservation's responsibility if something was to break, but large object handling is really, really useful to be able to say, as a team of only 2 conservators, to say, we've got this stuff to do. Could you help us, please? And I did used to feel a little bit guilty about that, because I thought, I'm taking these people away from their roles and their jobs, and I'm giving them essentially more responsibilities to do on a long list of responsibilities they've already got. But then, the particular team that we started working with was saying, no, we love this stuff. Let us help, please. If there's anything you need us, please, we want to help. This is really fun.
That's so good.
Store work in particular. So it sort of became this kind of this really nice working relationship of actually enabling us to do stuff in the store that had been sitting there for actual years, genuine, a decade probably. It also feels a little bit nice to be able to give people interested in collections handling experience and collections management experience as well. So it was really nice. That's my long rambling story of why I really like.
No, I love it.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's such a nice example of like a symbiotic relationship, and that then goes on to feed that front of house person's not only their own like personal interests in the sector, but also improves how they can deliver a front of house experience, right? If you've physically handled an object, you can describe that in a much different way to your visitors than just kind of looking at it as a passive thing. It's kind of active relationship.
That's exactly it. And I think I'd like to say as well, because I did harp on about the sort of physical ability to be able to do different jobs, and that is only one part of it. That I'd like to say also that it's the front of house members of staff in my museum that come in to see what's on the tables in my studio. They see stuff through that we've got a viewing window from one of the galleries, and they're the ones that come in. They see it through the window, they tell each other, and then they come in and talk to us about what the thing is. And often they'll spot things from the sort of object history side of things. They'll know stuff from their own knowledge and their own sort of their own, knowledge of the collection, knowledge of history that I had no idea about. And by chatting with them about the object that I'm, working on and should know everything about, I learn loads and I have a better understanding of the object myself. And it's really positive.
Oh, that's so lovely. I love that.
It is lovely. I miss my team. I miss my museum. Wow.
It just highlights how toxic siloing can be, isn't it? Why silos shouldn't be allowed to exist in museums, because of this exchange of knowledge, of experiences is informing all of us. Front of house are the best people for any kind of public engagement, because they do that on a daily basis. So exchanging the knowledge around collections and conservation, and with that public engagement, you've got a whole way to communicate about collections, about the material, about why they need to be careful, why something isn't on display anymore, rather than a front house team member saying, I don't know why it's not here.
Yeah,
they can
exactly.
immediately go with, it's because we are having to do this. It's amazing how those two sides. And again, it's sort of, for me, it links to Ryan role of front of house in conservation as preserving that intangible element, the human element of an object, that link to the past is continuing through the people who interact with it.
Can I ask you to explain the use of the term siloing?
So siloing is when you have, I guess, specific groups of people in a situation who work in a very narrow, defined thing and don't interact with the other groups of silos, like a grain silo. I guess you've got multiple grain silos and none of them interact with each other. But if you break those down, you've suddenly got a pool of people who can interact freely, engage with different ideas and concepts, and ensure that everyone is staying up to date with the latest information across different groups, rather than holding it all within that silo and controlling who gets access to it. Siloing can often alienate. It can create toxic work environments because people are being it's us and them sort of scenarios. And quite frankly, it's not true. It shouldn't be us and them. It should be all of the museum workers together, because we're all working for the same ultimate purpose in creating a public space for the public to engage in.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Mic drop.
Yeah. Sometimes I think working behind the scenes, you can be a little bit disillusioned about how, let's say, free your workspace is. That you kind of think that, obviously everyone's getting the same amount of clout in these discussions and stuff. And it's like, well, that might not be true. You may actually want to talk to the people and see if they actually feel as empowered as you think they are. Because it was a big eye-opener for me when someone went from a back of house role to a front of house role, and they said, well, actually it's a real upstairs downstairs vibe. And that's, I was surprised.
Ooh, good way of thinking about it.
And it was just like, oh shit, like that's not supposed to happen. But like, if that feeling is there, then it is happening, and you need to address that.
Well, when you hear front house talk about the experiences, it's sad to hear, because there's no reason for it to be happening. Getting rid of those silos ultimately will make organizations more representative, more of the different voices in the organization, and it only can create barriers to change, really, which need to happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
What actions can we take? I know it's difficult, conservation specifically, but there are conservation managers who listen. There are, all sorts of people who could make change.
Good question.
Yeah, really good question. Well, I mean, that kind of segues us quite nicely to, we've started the process of a charter for change.
Ooh.
I don't know if you might, but we're working as a network in support with the Museums Association to create a charter for change, which is going to have actionable steps that museums can follow. But obviously, we need to decide what those steps are.
It's a work in progress.
Yeah, keep an eye out for that. But I'd say communication is pretty important. Just that pure example you were giving, Kloe, about sort of chatting with your front of house and giving them the training. Like, I think it does come down to the workplace culture. The culture at work needs to support active, open communication between all parties. So it can be difficult as the one individual to kind of create that space for breaking down silos or opening communication or information sharing or whatever it is.
Yeah, it's an exchanging the skill set of front house for the skill set of conservators. There's many areas where front of house are specialists in. There's many areas where conservators are special in. Exchanging those skill sets helps spread the knowledge and the skill set so that both can be utilized in their own environments and expand the capacity and ability to communicate with the public, for example, but also into ensuring the conservation of our collections. It's a win-win situation simply by just having a chat.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. And you're not going to annoy someone by including them more, are you? What have your experiences as a community been, as community representatives been about the loss of jobs due to COVID?
A tragedy.
Yeah.
I think it is a front of house have led the recovery of the sector. From the very point museums are closed, elements of front of house were preparing museums to reopen. making plans, making sure museums actually were secure through that lockdown with security, with operations on site. Front of house have been intrinsic in understanding how public will behave, with communication of new guidance, ensuring to make people feel safe. So to see front of house out the front of a lot of cuts initially was horrible to see. And it's so sad because so many of us front of house people are wanting to communicate with the public and seeing those cuts. And in many ways, it's the economic reality is front of house often are much more associated with the economy of museums, exchange, income generation, that sort of thing. And front of house are going to be needed for recovery of the sector to build up that presence, to keep museums sustainable. I think front of house are going to be essential. So it's a quandary of, if you cut staff, it's going to stretch museum front of house team going forward. And how do you rebuild when you're starting from that artificial low?
Yeah, absolutely.
Have you known friends and colleagues who have lost their jobs due to COVID?
Many people who are still furloughed.
Yeah.
Right.
People who've had varying levels of communication from their organisations. Many people feel, and that's an important fact to recognise, is the impact on front of house being furloughed. And I know through social media and that sort of thing, where redundancy is taking place, the people who've been cut, and it's sad to see talking to people about and hearing that terrible news and the impacts it has. And in some degrees, not all the cuts you will notice. It may be that less seasonal people are recruited, less 0-hour people are recruited. Those are the ones who almost hidden figures, because the contract hasn't been made redundant because it didn't exist.
Yeah, it really puts into perspective the was it the Tate in the first lockdown? Was it around June time? I can't remember the exact numbers of actual contracts that they cut.
So front of house have had to, not only were they furloughed and have had redundancies and different things, and had very real demonstrations of how little they're cared about from their own institution. I'd say for those who, obviously the experience has kind of varied for different places, but for the areas that I've worked in, we were busy. Queue managing, social distancing, wearing PPE all day, trying to manage people going to the toilets, all different things. I don't think there's one single colleague that I've spoken to who hasn't had some level of negative conversation, possibly borderline abuse. So, I think everyone across the sector has really suffered very stressful times. But as a network, we were kind of talking about this in the reopening conversation. Sort of front of house should be prioritised in consideration of reopening factors and should be discussing this. But how much discussion I saw actually happening, I don't know. On the other hand, though, with all the difficulties, it was also lovely to open the doors. It was really nice it was kind of a miracle that we could even do such a thing. Old buildings are not designed with one-way systems in mind. It's sort of a miracle that we could even do that in the first place. And initially it was lovely to open the front doors. But I think for the public, for them, it must be really difficult too, because you're essentially just coming in and joining a queue, and you're in a queue for a really long time. And it's quite stop and start how much you can look at something. You're kind of encouraged to continue moving. Lots of operational difficulty and kind of in general mental health difficulty. Redeployments as well. Oh, crikey. Well, if anyone wants to get in touch with their redeployment experiences, we'd love to hear from you.
Perfect.
Hopefully now reopening is on the horizon again. I know that it varies a little bit across the different countries in the UK, for example, when things are likely to be able to open again, I think. But it is on the
Recording
horizon.
16th of March, just saying.
Yeah.
Seeing as stuff can change constantly and will.
Yes. I think we all look forward to being back to being open and being able to welcome people again. So that's something to look forward to.
I say museums really have an opportunity to get themselves involved in the community this time around, having this almost like a blank slate to start again with.
Yeah.
To build a confidence of the community to come back out in public in museums which have proven to be quite COVID-safe environments, done really well. Museums have a chance to really be the point where people choose to come back in and take part in the wider society and engage in the public again.
Yeah.
And like, to circle back to volunteers in a way, one of the main reasons we see in our particular organisation volunteers do volunteer is the social aspect of it. They make friends, they often meet up outside of the museum and that sort of thing. And yeah, to only allow sort of 2 people at a time to go on a tea break, where normally they'd have like a room full of people having a conversation about whatever. But even to just allow that small element of it has been really beneficial, I think. But yeah, I think we're all looking forward to the day that COVID's under control and we can all sort of interact in sort of safety and peace, you know?
Yeah, definitely. And that time will come, so it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
We just need to hang in there.
Get your vaccines, everybody. Get your vaccines.
Exactly. I thought we have already talked about the sort of things that bring us joy about what we do, but what is the best thing about doing what you do? Like, what is the best thing, in your opinion, about, you know, being front of house?
For me, it's that connection. Making a connection between the visitor and the collection, the visitor and the front of house members. You knowing you've told that story, like their knowledge has grown, for example, or they see the museum in a different way. It's the opportunity to really talk to a public and sort of share the museum to them, and seeing that connection, that joy, that interest.
I love hearing people say, you know, people will say things like, oh, I've had the most fun that I've had in a really long time at things, or they'll really appreciate what you've just explained to them, or you can have these very, nuanced conversations around a subject. You can have them in kind of big subjects and small subjects. There's a point that I always like to make when I finish a tour, for example. At the Roman bath, it's the spring of the water, where the water emerges. And we've got evidence that people were there from the Mesolithic era. And I like to say that, you know, we're standing exactly where someone from that point stood, with their hopes, their dreams, their own human lived experience. And we're all part of that experience today. It's an awfully cheesy line, but I think it's true. It's like that amazing human connection of being at a site and sort of walking that same ground that was walked by people thousands of years ago. You never get tired or bored of that.
That is great. Thank you so much for sharing that as well.
Beautiful.
I'd love to hear from other front of house members and other conservators about your favorite interactions and how you've worked together. I would love to hear that. Do share with us on Twitter, etc. We'd love to hear from you. How do you guys keep in touch with you guys if they'd like to follow you, etc.?
So we're at FOH Museums on Twitter. We also have a blog, which you can find via the Twitter.
We'll put links to all of those in the show notes just in case anyone needs them. Wow, thank you guys so much for coming on today and sharing this with us. That was really great.
Thank you for having us. It's been fun.
As usual, we would love to hear your comments, questions, or corrections. We've had a lot of wonderful emails and messages in between the seasons. Some great suggestions for future episodes, which we're hoping to take on board. If there's anything you'd like to say to us, get in touch. We're on a number of social media platforms, and we genuinely love hearing from you. If you're enjoying the C Word and would like to support our work, then please consider becoming one of our patrons. For as little as $1 per month, you can help us keep our episodes online and more of them coming. Patreon helps us meet our regular costs for the show, and also to plan ahead so we know roughly how much of a monthly budget we've got. That's super helpful when you're trying to do something special, like buy a better microphone or save up to go to a special event. Your support also helps keep us free of advertisements. In return, our supporters get access to our archive of extended episodes, which you can only access on our Patreon page. Yeah, for that $1 a month, you get a little extra audio enjoyment. We've crunched the numbers, and it's about 10% extra content on a regular basis. Well, that's not bad for less than a cup of coffee, eh? If supporting us sounds like something you'd like to do, then head over to patreon.com/thecword and join our bunch of absolute champions. And this time we'd like to welcome our latest patrons, Laura and Christopher. Welcome, guys, and thank you. Thanks for listening. We're the C Word, and you've been listening to Will Tregaskes, Abby Godfrey, Kloe Rumsey, and me, Jenny Mathiasson. Join us next time for an episode about extreme storage. In the meantime, check out our website at thecword.show, tweet us at the C Word Podcast, or simply email us on thecwordpodcast@gmail.com. The intro and outro music is Spring by Music, used under a Creative Commons Attribution License. Additional music and sound effects by Callum Robertson. This has been a Wooden Dice production.
Sorry, I've got a work call coming. This is really bad. As you can imagine, in front of the house, you always got this coming in. So are you happy if I just step out momentarily?
Yes, that's absolutely fine. We'll talk amongst ourselves.
Sorry.
No, don't worry.
Sorry.
That is what it's like being a man in
That's a great example, isn't it?
Yeah, I know, right? I think that stays. It's just like, well, you know what? That's important.